I'm super excited for the next speaker. Admiral Richardson served for 37 years in the Navy. He culminated as the 31st Chief of Naval Operations. But what I really want to hone in on is, every time we would get in a conversation about Kessel Run, people would say, yeah, but what about the boats? How are you going to do this on a boat? And I was like, Adam, you got to go find me some Navy content. And he found this amazing and inspiring speech by Admiral Richardson, and one of the quotes in there became super foundational to everything we do. It's about the team that puts together the people, the process, and the technology to learn the fastest. That's the team that has the advantage. And so, perfect lead into this conversation about how do we organize for success, and specifically, how do we organize for learning, because that is what makes the most successful teams.
Thank you. Okay, I'm good. I got the. Okay, I'm going to be a little old school and stay at the podium here, mostly out of respect for you, because I could really start talking about this and just go on and on and on, run and bust the calendar, all the pieces. It's a real honor to be here. I want to thank Bryon and Sierra and everybody from Rise 8 who does this, who put this together. Putting something like this together is super hard. I mean, it is just amazingly hard. And yesterday went great. Today is going great. So thanks. I'd also like to thank all of our mentor, Gene Kim. It's just great to have him lead off the whole conference and set the tone. And also our shadow partner, Steve Spear, who's somewhere in the world right now, but he's been really formative to some of the ideas here. I guess, a nice introduction that Bryon gave me, but to put it shortly, I am one of those leaders to whom Max was pandering, okay? And it's okay to be that person, right? I mean, and Max wasn't the only person that pandered. There's a lot of pandering that goes on, and I want to talk a little bit about that system, okay? And really kind of think about how do I want you all to feel at the end of this talk, right? And what I hope to achieve is that you leave this conference with sort of a notebook full of ideas that you want to go and just can't wait to share with your teams to make them all get better, right? So in a sense, I'm talking to you, my audience, but possibly in just as an important sense, I'm talking to your audience, right? My audience's audience. And so I hope to deliver some things that you can take back and find useful for your teams. Okay, and I'm going to try and accelerate my talk a little bit to get us back on time. I would say that one thing that characterizes these conferences like this and these discussions is that I think that they're a little bit far too polite. And you hear people correct themselves about, hey, our peer competitor, wait, hold on, near peer, right? And it's like, no, peer is perfectly appropriate to say, if not in some areas better than us, right? And so to just sort of zoom out, I think that I firmly believe that if we don't get this right in the defense business, then much more quickly than we'd like to think, the United States will lose its place in the world, and we are in danger of losing our style of life, okay? I mean, that's the stakes at which I was trying to instill a sense of urgency as my time as the Chief of the Navy. And it's not just for us, right? It'll be for our kids and their kids. And this is a monumental period of time right now. There's a lot on the line, and so forgive me if I come across a little bit direct, but I'm always out there trying to get an answer to the question of how can we have our Pearl Harbor moment without having Pearl Harbor, right? And we don't have a history of doing that very well. Not too many teams do, but things are moving so fast now, and we'll talk a little bit about that, that we're not going to have years to catch up and get better, and it's going to happen much more quickly, right? And we may never catch up. I'd like to start, there's that old yarn, if you want a new idea, then read an old book. And I want to start with a little bit of Navy history, go back to sort of the turn of the century, 1900 or so. And there's a lot to be learned, I think, from that period of time. in that the United States at that time had sort of reached its continental boundaries in terms of continuing to prosper. And if we were going to continue to grow as a nation, and we were growing as a nation and a people, continuing to be prosperous, we had to go offshore, right? We had to go overseas, get access to overseas market. We had to get established sea lines of communication. We had to become a global nation. And just again, my perspective in the Navy, we had to develop a global Navy to deliver the responsibilities that the Navy had to the nation, all right? And so we did some things at that time which were addressed that challenge. We established the Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey, California. Has anybody been out there? I mean, it's some sweet real estate, Monterey, California. It's really close to Silicon Valley, like a short drive. And so that was established in 1908, really to sort of help us get into the technology that was manifesting itself from the Industrial Revolution at the time, right? So that's where we taught our leaders about how this technology could be used. And then simultaneously almost, right in a little bit before that, actually, 1884, we established the Naval War College up in Newport, Rhode Island, and that was to teach kind of the strategy and war plans and such that would go with the mission of being a global Navy, all right? And it really didn't take long for us to put all of that in action, all right? And I just want to talk about a period between the two world wars, World War I and World War II, which is sort of like an iconic example of a learning environment where we just went up to Newport over and over and over again and held these war games in terms of how to solve the problem of winning the war in the Pacific, okay? And it was, just like the scientific method in action, right? We would have, a hypothesis. This is the plan that we think will work. We would run the war game against a really robust red team, and eventually it would fail. It would break, right? And so we'd make some adjustments, get the team together, and run it again. And this was not something that was delegated down to, the lieutenant commanders or the commanders. The fleet commanders were there, right? They were participating in this. In fact, it was so critical and so important that if you demonstrated poor decision-making at these war games, it would affect your promotion opportunities, right? If you demonstrated that you couldn't cut it or you made bad decisions in these games, we would just sort of gently move you to the side, and the people that really move the problem forward would get promoted, okay? And this all included technology as well. So there's this nice tension between, the conversation, hey, from an operational standpoint, if I only had something like this, it would enable me to do all of this, and then we'd go back and say, well, we can build that. And then and in fact, what could you do with something like this? And I was like, oh. So there's this great conversation. And out of that came War Plan Orange and the Rainbow Plans, which were the starting point for the beginning of the war, okay? So they had this great learning environment leading up to the beginning of the war. And despite all that, as many of you might know, when the war broke out and December 7th, 1941 happened, and we went out and started to put all of these plans into action, it went terribly, right? I mean, the U.S. Navy just got its clock cleaned by the enemy at the time, despite all of this learning. And so we had to kind of keep learning, right? Only this time you had to do it under fire. And it was so bad that, the Guadalcanal campaign, for instance, 1942, we would go into a battle and we would, lose 5 ships and the enemy would lose 0. Okay, it was just terrible. They named this big body of water Iron Bottom Sound because so many ships were sunk in that body of water that it was just really getting desperate. And we almost lost the initiative very early on, which was exactly the enemy's strategy, right? They knew that the industrial engine, if it ever got started, would be overwhelming, so they had to get a quick victory, and they almost got it. The Board of Inquiry that took a look at that period of time had a phrase that I think should send chills up all of our spine right now. They said that really what had happened was there was a pervasive lethargy of mind in the operational fleet and in the Navy bureaucracy, meaning that we had just grown arrogant. We figured that because we deserved to win, we would win, and that this would be a cakewalk. We'd just go out and make it happen. And in fact, the reality was much different. And so we didn't give in. And despite all of those losses, what saved us was that by virtue of that process, the Navy had become a learning organization, right? So we had learning in our DNA, and those commanding officers and their crews out there, they were so close to the problem, right? I mean, they were in the problem, and in many ways, they were the problem. And they realized that, and they started to learn on the fly. And the system that Admiral Nimitz established in the Pacific was fantastic in terms of providing enough room and authority and freedom to innovate, report back your successes. They would collate those successes, take best of breed, and issue them back out. And so the whole fleet improved, every single community. So in carrier operations, surface operations, destroyers in particular, submarines, which is my community, which we got an F- at the start of the war. We learned and adapted faster than the enemy throughout the war, and that was the difference maker. It's the team that can learn the fastest, because despite your best guess, it's just too complex a thing. You're never going to get it all right. And so you've got to have these feedback loops built in, okay? And we ended up prevailing. What about that interwar effort? Well, as I said, it kind of instilled learning in our DNA, but it was also key that our leaders were participating, right? So many senior leaders say, look, it's not the plan that's so important, it's the planning process. Right? And so you've got to participate, you got to be there for all those discussions. And the fleet commander in the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz, said, hey, look, by virtue of participating in those games, really I wasn't too surprised by anything that I saw during the war in the Pacific, except for one thing, right? Anybody know what that is? Kamikaze. Kamikaze. Who said that? All right, you get an A+. All right, yeah, nobody had anticipated the suicide dive bombers, the kamikaze attacks, all right? But everything else, it may have not made it into the final plan, but they had discussed it, right? They had appreciated it. They had done an excursion on it. And so, you could go back to that experience and adapt the plan much more rapidly, okay? So, and I think a lot of these same factors can be said at the beginning of the Cold War. So the Industrial Revolution was the technological revolution that sort of spurred on World War II. The atomic and space revolution were the ones that sort of, got the Cold War kicked off. And I think a lot of those same features were there. If you think about the prototyping, the experimentation, the numbers of different things that we built, the different tries that we had, the goal that President Kennedy set to get on the moon in this decade, just inspired an entire national effort to learn faster than the Soviet Union. Okay, and recently we've had sort of a poignant moment with the death of Mikhail Gorbachev to sort of think about that entire Cold War and how it came to its end. I will tell you that from my perspective, we just learned faster and became an economically and intellectually superior force over time, and that's what allowed us to win. It has to be in our DNA. Okay. Fast forward to now. Why do I bring up this history? What's happened since then? And I'll leave aside any discussions of operations and strategy. That's for a different conference. But I think that there's a case to be made that we've lost a little bit of our edge in terms of being a learning organization. And to kind of address Max's architecture, if you will, his discussion framework, I think that our system, the way that we're organized, our architecture, our acquisition system has really missed two major inflection points since it was drawn up. One inflection point was the introduction of the microprocessor. All right. So the system we have right now is basically the PPBS system, planning, programming, budget, and something. And it was put together by Secretary McNamara in 1961. And it really hasn't been major adjusted since that time. A lot of analysis, decision-making all centralized at the top so that we were sure that we would not make a mistake. And so from its onset, it was really not very friendly to innovation and fast learning. It was, let's study this some more, and let's make sure that our decision is centralized at the top, okay? The natural frequency of that system, if you will, is about one delivery every 20 years. Okay, that's kind of the traditional time frame it takes to design and test and build a major platform, a ship or an aircraft or a tank or whatever. That's kind of the system, the resonant frequency of our system. That doesn't mean you can't go faster, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy to make this system oscillate at something other than its resonant frequency, right? And so that's what you find. Think about the MRAP, all right? It took the Secretary of Defense like almost daily coming in and standing on people's heads to get this MRAP delivered faster than one delivery every 20 years. And this is something that was going to save people's lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay? What's happened since that PPBS system was put in place? Well, like I said, the microprocessor, that does not beat at a frequency of one every 20 years. What's a good frequency for microprocessor growth? 18 months, yeah, I mean, it's kind of Moore's Law, right? Ish. You think about storage, you think about all the things that go into a computer. Let's be generous and say 3 to 5 years, okay? Anything happening at a 3 to 5 year pace right now? Not really. If it does, it's an exception, it's an add-on. We've got these things, other transactional authorities, and these sort of, Mr. Potato Head add-ons to help us move faster, but it's not really, fundamentally changing the system. So not one beat every 20 years, but one beat every, let's say, 4 years. That's how fast that system moves. Learns, right? That's the learning pace of that system. And then what we're all gathered here to talk about is software, right? And what's the natural frequency of that? I mean, you heard Gene, I think in your talk, 135,000 per day, pushes per day for Amazon. So, I mean, much, much faster, right? So that's another sort of resonant frequency. And so when you think about Max's quadrants there, right, it's fundamental. I think it's important to understand that, we're basically operating in a system that moves at that slow frequency. It's not to say it's irrelevant. We still have to deliver platforms. We still have to deliver aircraft and those sorts of things. But the thing that makes them capable, right, the systems that they carry, that's just the truck. What can we put on the truck? The systems that make it have, and the software that runs those systems moves at a much, much faster pace. And so if we're going to learn faster than the enemy, we have to learn at that pace, okay? And so let's just walk through, I think, Max's slides, but from through the lens of learning, okay? So could I have the first slide? All right, so I think Gene showed this yesterday. It's basically Max's quadrant, and you can see that on the vertical axis, it's sort of this idea of proximity to the problem, and on the horizontal axis, it's just how much bureaucracy do I have to fight through to get to a solution, right? So let's recast this a little bit from a learning perspective, all right? So I'm going to say, look, that vertical axis is really your ability to see the problem. The closer you are to the problem, the much clearer vision you have of that problem. You can identify it, you can define it, right? And you can see it that much more clearly. So as you get to the top of that axis, you're seeing the problem much more clearly and much more quickly, okay? And then on the horizontal axis is your ability to solve the problem. All right? So, how many layers do you have to fight through to get the solution into the hands of the person who needs it? All right? And so now we can start to map out these quadrants. And, as Max said, it's not important, where the dots stand relative to one another. It's really kind of where do they lie in this spectrum, right, compared to where they should be, right? Let me pause right here, though, and ask a question. Who would fancy themselves in the audience, just raise your hand, please, to be sort of a member of one of the teams that is represented by a dot on this slide? Who would say they're part of one of those teams? You can raise your hand. It's okay. In fact, everybody raise your hand. We'll just do mountain pose, okay, or whatever, Tadasana or Shiva. Yeah, okay. So who thinks they're one of these in one of these teams? Who fancies themselves? Okay. You are the blue team, okay? Who fancies themselves as a person who has the authority to move one of those dots in this quadrant? Okay, so you think that you could make life better for one of these teams because you've got the approach. Okay, you are the gold team. Okay, blue and gold, go Navy. All right. Okay, so we've recast this in terms of learning, the ability to see the problem and solve the problem. All right. Way too many teams captured in the slow learning quadrant. All right? This is the team that has a difficulty seeing the problem, and if they get a glimpse of it, is bound by some constraints, some obstacles to solving the problem. Okay? So a lot of teams in that quadrant, right? In this quadrant, this is the team that could maybe solve problems, but they can't see any problems. There's no dots in that one, which was kind of a question I had. Why is that? And I think it's because, if you can solve the problem, right? If you're kind of that connected to it, you're going to find problems, right? There's nobody out there who's not finding problems. Okay, so that's why that one is blank. Up here in the upper left, they can see the problem, but they just can't quickly solve, right? For whatever reasons, the team is feeling constrained. They're not parked in the right place of the architecture or whatever. We'll talk a little bit about that going forward. And then finally, of course, we have the quadrant of nirvana, the fast learning quadrant, right? Very close to the problem. They can see it, they can clearly define it, and they've got what it takes to act on that and solve the problem very quickly. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of the time, perhaps, talking about what we can do to get everybody up in that quadrant, right? Whether you're on the sole representative of the gold team or a member of the blue team, which many of you raised your hand and said that you were, okay? So to the gold group, sir, I think that it goes back to a lot of the things that Max was talking about. Max used the term accountability. I would use the term ownership, right, which includes accountability. I'm kind of a nuke by nature, so I'm going to tell you that the ownership has 4 particles in its nucleus, all right? 4 elements. One of those is accountability, as Max said. The other one is expertise, okay? And so we'll come back to that. But if you don't know what you're doing, as enthusiastic as you might be, you're just not going to know right from wrong, and it's going to go slow. All right? The other one is responsibility. And I think we've all felt in our time that we were responsible for something. And then the real missing part, the thing that distinguishes, it could probably move those teams more up towards the upper right than any other thing, is authority. Okay? And what we find is that too often we give a team a mission, we make sure that they understand that, hey, I'm holding you responsible for this, achieving this thing, and oh, by the way, if you don't, I'm going to hold you accountable, but oh, by the way, I'm not going to give you all of the authority you need to actually go do it. Has anybody been in that type of a situation? Yeah, I mean, and if your hand is not raised, I don't know why. And when I say authority, that's not just, the authority to say yes and no, to authorize things, but it's also the budgetary resources to do those things, right? So it's great if I've got the authority to say yes or no, but if I don't have the resources to actually make it happen, then that's, it's like kissing your sister, if you will, right? So, so if those elements are not all present, gold team, then you've got to think about, why not, right? Why am I think most of the time it comes that I'm holding authority too close. I'm not trusting the team enough to give them the authority, the resources to go and do this thing and come back and report to me, right? So there's a good book to read if you want. It's called The Outliers. It's by William Thorndike. It's a corporate version of this same problem. It talks about a handful of CEOs that went out there and just, really outperformed the market and outperformed their peers. And you sort of ask, okay, well, what distinguished those folks? Well, it's because they could really discern the difference between what headquarters does best and what the operators do best, and they let the operators go off and do what they do best, okay? It's a great book. It's about capital allocation. So if you're in the goal group, trying to remove some of these obstacles, remove some of these constraints, you've got to look deeply into yourself and figure out why, is the team parked in the right place to enable fast learning? Do they have the fewest bureaucratic obstacles, particularly as something that needs to move at, let's say, 100,000 beats per day, right? Not one beat every 20 years. If you're doing it at one beat every 20 years, day-to-day progress, it's easy to just sort of, we'll get to that tomorrow, right? So, okay, for the blue group, all right? I guess I would, just encourage you, as a person who listened to a lot of teams come up and pitch different ideas, I would say the ones that were most compelling to me were the teams that really never saw the constraints in the first place, right? They just sort of figured out how to peer through a lot of those obstacles and do tremendous work inside the ownership that they had, okay? And Max touched on this, right? So if all the constraints were removed, some of them real, some of them I think perceived, could your team, what is the maximum performance your team could do unconstrained, right? Envision that, and then just go do it, right? Just perform as close as possible as if those constraints did not exist. And I think in software, those constraints, we always talk about, hey, low barrier for entry, right? I think that translates also into, hey, you can overcome a lot of these constraints. If you don't feel like you're close enough to the problem, then there's the ways to connect to that are better now than they ever have been. So just do it. And if you're calling up the person who's wrestling with this problem, and you say, hey, look, I've got a team, I think I can provide you a solution, that person will talk to you, right? So just overcome, some of these constraints. Think about an unconstrained environment, an environment where there are no obstacles. What is your maximum performance? Go and do that. Another bit of advice, don't underestimate the energy that it's going to take to do this. It's going to take a lot of energy. Revolution doesn't happen on its own, right? Even though you deserve everything that you're asking for, that doesn't mean you're going to get it. You're going to have to go and you're going to have to take it. So you just got to be ready for that level of effort. Kind of consistent with this, act as if you're unconstrained. Just be mindful that you're operating in an architecture that's one beat every 20 years, right? And if you try and, Max was a little bit too polite, I think, right? And Bryon said, hey, we're all here to figure out how to hack the system, right? I think we need to take that mindset. But please, do that in a way that does no harm, right? We've got to be very sophisticated about this. So how are you going to hack the system in a way that does no harm to the system? Because if you're perceived as doing harm, the deflector shields are going to come up, and it's going to get very, very difficult. So you got to be very, very clever and all of you are, or you wouldn't be here. And then the third thing is most of your bosses, the gold team folks, you're the exception, they don't understand what you do. They just don't understand it, right? So how are you going to talk to your leadership in a way that makes them feel like, okay, this is something I cannot say no to anymore. This is so decisive, and I've got a great sense of trust in this team that's talking to me right now. I'm gonna give them ownership of a really important thing, right? I may ask them to come back and talk to me a lot because it's new to me, and it's important, so I wanna know how it's going. But by and large, that brief was so compelling in terms that I could understand. It was not condescending, right? It didn't sort of start with the assumption that I'm a dope, right? If you go in with, okay, here I go to brief the dope at the top, good luck. It's not gonna go well. You want that leader to, at the end of your discussion, feel like, oh my God, this is fantastic. This capability must happen as fast as possible, and this is the exact team to make it happen, all right? So I'll stop there. I'm about 22 seconds away from the clock. If we can do that, if we can achieve performance in that upper right-hand quadrant, right, where the teams move, they have been granted full ownership, they can define the problem, they can move at relative speed, platforms, every decade, I think we could probably half the time it takes to design and build a hull, an airframe, whatever. Systems at a 3 to 5 year time frame, software as fast as you can code it and validate it and push it out. If we do that, I think we have a chance of learning faster than the enemy, maintaining our place in the world, and guaranteeing a life we'd all be proud to hand off to our children and descendants. Thank you very much.